Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Book at Lunchtime event on Shipwreck in French Renaissance writing, The Direful Spectacle, written by Jenny Oliver. My name's Professor Wes Williams, and I'm the director here at Torch, and it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce this, the third Book at Lunchtime of this academic year. Book at Lunchtime is, as many of you will know, Torch's flagship event series, taking the form of more or less weekly bite-sized book discussions with a range of commentators. Please do take a look at our website and newsletter for the full program for the rest of term. I'm delighted to welcome Jenny here today to speak about her book. Also on the panel are Professor Andrew Kahn, Professor Zoltán Biedermann, and Professor Katherine Ibbett. In a moment, I'll hand over to Katherine, who'll introduce the book and the rest of the panel briefly. This will be followed by a reading by Jenny from the book itself. Afterwards, our commentators will present their thoughts, approaching the work from their different specialism areas of expertise. We'll then give Jenny a chance to respond to some of the points raised before entering into what promises to be a fascinating discussion with questions from you. So please do add any questions you have to the Q&A box as we go along. I'll moderate those questions and try to animate the wider discussion in the second part of the hour we have together. All that's left for me to do for now then, before I disappear from your screens, is to thank you all for coming and to briefly introduce our chair. Katherine Ibbett is a fellow in French at Trinity College here in Oxford. Her work focuses on early modern literature, culture, and political thought. Her second book, Compassion's Edge, after a first book about the theatre, the second book won the biennial prize for the Society of Renaissance Studies. She's now working on a third book, Liquid Empire, on the writing of water in early modern France and its territories. Compassion and liquidity of various kinds, from the sea to salty tears, are key themes in Jenny's book, and so it's hard to think of anyone better to start this discussion going. As I say, I'll disappear from your screens now, I hope, and hand over the tiller, last of the metaphors for now, to Katherine.
I don't think it'll be the last of the metaphors. I'm going to help us steer in today's stormy waters. And I'm first of all going to introduce our author of The Direful Spectacle, Dr. Jennifer Oliver, who is departmental lecturer in French at Worcester College. Jenny is now moving on to work on a second book that brings together interests that I think are evident already in this volume, and perhaps we can talk about that, working on questions of poetics, technology, and the natural. And in addition to these writing projects, she's also the co-organizer of a really fabulous series of workshops and journées d'études on questions of writing technology in early modern Europe and beyond. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a link to that in the chat if that intrigues any of you. I'd also like to introduce today our two panelists briefly. Our first, after Jenny's reading, our first speaker will be Professor Zoltán Biedermann, who is a professor of early modern history at UCL in the School of European Literature, Culture and Society. Zoltán is a specialist historian of the Portuguese empires in Asia, and he's recently been working in a sort of public engagement vein with Portuguese political activists to think about the significance of the Portuguese Empire. And he's now working on a book on early modern travel literature and cartography. And our second respondent will be Professor Andrew Kahn, closer to home here in Oxford. He's Professor of Russian Literature and Fellow and Tutor at St. Edmund Hall and a Fellow of the British Academy. Andrew is a specialist in Enlightenment studies and in Pushkin, but he also has interests in the history of science that I think will play into, and in visual studies that will play into our discussion today. I'm really looking forward to that, but we're going to lead off now with a reading from Jenny. Jenny, thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine, and thank you to Wes, who, if anyone reads the prologue to this book, people will realise knows rather a lot about this book already. It's a real honour to be here today, and for anyone who's met me, I think you know that I'm interested in craft of various kinds, and so this reminds me a bit of Stephen Sondheim's saying that he was finishing a hat and then he wrote a book called Look, I Made a Hat. So thank you for joining me to look at my hat today. I thought, in looking back in just 5 minutes over what I've done in this book. The best way of giving an account is to show probably the top and tail of the conclusion, where I'm drawing together some of the broadest threads that run across the whole thing. So I'll be gesturing to some of the things that are raised in more detail in the different chapters of the book, with the hope that we will delve into those in more detail in the discussion that follows. So one of the central aims of this study has been to show how over the course of the 16th century, the effective power of shipwreck was increasingly associated with the theatrical dynamics of spectatorship. In the latter decades of the century, the trauma of the French Civil Wars was articulated in both political and poetic discourse through metaphors of shipwreck with spectator, and as Andrea Frisch has shown, through the privileged theatrical mode of the ancients. It was perhaps thanks to this particularly intense period of introspection in France that, through metaphorical triangulation, the dynamics of spectated shipwreck and those between the stage and its audience became twinned. This conclusion will examine the ways in which the theatricality of shipwreck found its fullest expression in a series of dramatic settings in the early 17th century. These theatrical shipwrecks did indeed reflect back on the all too recent catastrophe of the wars of religion, but they also did important work as stagings of other relationships predicated on fellow feeling, whether among particular confessional, familial, or other groups, or between plays and spectators, authors and readers. In view of this, the interpretation of shipwreck must be construed as political. Today, in an age where such disasters are again weighing on European consciences, just as much as in the early modern period, not only in the context of statecraft, but in a broader sense, as it relates to both individuals and communities. So that's the top of the conclusion, and in that I discuss two plays, a French tragedy, Les Portugais Infortunés, French retelling of a Portuguese shipwreck in Africa, and The Tempest, as well as a theatrical scene, a famous scene from Daubigny's Les Tragiques, the epic poem of the Civil Wars. So I'm going to take you now past those to the end of the conclusion. Wrapping up the shipwreck section on The Tempest, I finished shipwreck in The Tempest allows its characters to model and critique the spectatorial relationship, an exploration also found in the scenes of shoreline distress and resulting action in the travel writing of Bruno's Histoire Véritable. This fascination with the dynamics of compassion in response to shipwreck, explored more fully still in Les Portugais Infortunés just a few years earlier, an especially vivid marker of the currents of cultural exchange between Portugal, France, and England at the turn of the 17th century, also speaks of the cultural and especially colonial anxieties particular to each nation. The Direful Spectacle has been concerned for the most part with the changing place of shipwreck within the narrative scope of texts over the course of the 16th century. Whereas in the Nef, discussed in chapter 1, so a mini genre I discuss in the first chapter of books that call themselves ships, shipwreck stood as the potential endpoint to life's journey. Later texts presented the shipwreck as an episode that could itself form the basis of a narrative. And at the latter end of the corpus, in Bruno's Histoire Véritable, and then in Les Portugais Infortunés, as in Les Tragiques and The Tempest, shipwreck moves to the beginning of the story. It's no longer simply the just punishment for overweening curiosity, but an allegory of the trials of life. Whereas in the Ship of Fools tradition, shipwreck is the inevitable outcome of a sinful life, and in Rabelais' Quart Livre, the storm scene, the reason for the sparing of the Talamège is the crux of debate. In later texts, the response of men and women to the predicament of shipwreck comes to constitute a turning point, a moment of peripeteia. Bruno's second récit, for example, tells of a community of men who rebuild their ship and themselves several times over, while in Chrétien's tragedy, Les Portugais Infortunés, the failed attempt of the Portuguese shipwreck survivors to elicit compassion from their captors results in their eventual death. As I've argued throughout, the process of rebuilding, or bricolage, is particularly pertinent to 16th century French shipwreck narrative. In the latter text of the corpus, it forms part of the narrative itself, as in Léry and Bruno's Histoire. But throughout, this study has also traced a common thread of textual bricolage from early to late Renaissance texts, whether more weakly in the reorientation of the central shipwreck metaphor in those Nef books of chapter 1, or most strongly in the necessary crisis-driven reappropriation of commonplaces and nautical conventions seen in later chapters. It is apparent that the significance of shipwreck is constantly debated and contested. Furthermore, the possibility of rebuilding and the suggestion that shipwreck is not always the end of the narrative, a hope anticipated by a character I point out, Montaigne's wet-clothed survivor figure, also afford a new way of thinking about shipwreck, one in which it offers redemption, either to its victims or to the witnesses and spectators of their stories. And this last point brings me to the final thread of the conclusion. While in the earliest of the shipwreck texts, the relationship between author and reader was conducted through a morally prescriptive text, whose allegorical interpretation was firmly policed, later shipwreck narratives, while arguably equally didactic, focused ever more strongly on the interpretative process itself. Affective responses, rather than other forms of behavior, became the target of shipwreck narrative and poetry, as the relationships of cooperation among communities on board and between seafarers and shore dwellers came to replace the individualized focus of the Nef. In the shift that removed shipwreck from its terminal role and made it the subject of narrative itself, both author and reader were removed effectively from any stable spectatorial vantage point. As shipwreck becomes the figure of miseria hominis, in today's language, the human condition, the fraught question of taking to sea, to board or not to board, becomes obsolete. The progressive theatricalization of shipwreck affords readers and spectators fleeting moments of reflection on their own inescapable reality. While the kind of precise moral instruction offered by the authors of the Nef at the turn of the 16th century is notably lacking in Bruno's Histoire or in the Portugais Infortuné, the promises of merveille that both make, marvels, along with their vivid staging of compassionate responses, point to the possibility of recovery, rebuilding, and a life beyond shipwreck.
Thanks so much, Jenny. It was a pleasure to hear that again. One of the things I was really struck by in your book is the emphasis on the kind of cooperative projects post-shipwreck. And in that light, I'm going to ask us to build a response to your work here. I'm going to call first on Zoltán, who's going to respond.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to the Torch team for inviting me today. Thank you, Katherine, for the introduction. And of course, Jennifer, for providing me with food for thought with this fine book, which I have in my hand. And it's such a pleasure to still hold a hard copy of any book in your hands these days, isn't it? My students are often astonished by the abundance of early modern shipwreck narratives. They also realize, enthralled, the sheer amount of time that such disasters could take to unfold. A plane crash takes minutes. A naufrage could take days and nights on end. The reason we have shipwreck accounts is that naufrage often happened close enough to the land for some people to survive. The element of spectatorship that we have already heard mentioned is crucial in the Portuguese literary tradition, which was particularly rich in this regard, and it clearly emerges as a very important aspect in this book too. Eyewitness narratives of shipwrecks thrive on that uncanny spectatorial space appearing between those on a lifeboat and those on a sinking vessel. I don't think any other means of transportation can provide this kind of experience, a disaster happening just far enough for one not to be pulled into the waters with the sinking ship, but also close enough for one to discern the shadows and hear the screams of fellow travelers going under. I quite like the way, Jennifer, you start with a story suspended between fact and fiction, the story of La Grande Françoise, a vessel, a magnificent ship built in 1520 in Le Havre, if I remember correctly, a ship that never left port because it just didn't work. A ship that ended up being dismantled, its timber used to build houses where people went on to live, and probably to tell stories of shipwrecks for many more years than the ship itself might have served. I have a few comments that I will just fire off very quickly. I was struck by the problem of agency and responsibility, or what our managerial elite now calls leadership. In a way, I was surprised not to read more about the figure of the skipper, the captain, the commander. In the shipwreck literature that I know, these men, and we're always talking about men, are often quite central to the drama on grounds of their incompetence, their pride, their lack of character, and so on. Secondly, how exactly does the emerging dynastic state, the embryo of the nation state of La Grande Nation, the French nation, inevitably very, very present in your book, of course, how exactly does it come into the picture in relation to other earlier forms of political organization to which the ship could refer? And by this, I mean, of course, the urban community, which was constitutive of the late medieval world, if you want, on the one hand, and also that larger unit, the empire, the sprawling empires of the 16th century. I was reminded upon reading your book of the large ship of state put on display in Brussels in 1558 after the death of Charles V. It's decorated with the banners of the many territories of Charles's empire on both sides of the ocean. And importantly, what about that crucial larger thing, the planet we live on? We know from the work of Dennis Cosgrove how important the nascent sense and the nascent vision of being together on Earth became in the late 16th century, which of course carries implications for the study of ethnicity, race, the myth of continents, gender in the early modern world, and so on and so on. Would you say that your materials might support further debates about such topics, or rather not? Last but not least, I was quite moved by some passages in your conclusion from which you have just read. At one point, you gestured to the way many people today question the possibility of compassion for refugees in unseaworthy boats by interrogating their motives. Did those people, we are asked by the right-wing press, really have to be there on the water? Could they not have avoided death and saved us the bother by staying at home? Such questions, let's not forget it, are being asked by some of the most qualified, most privileged, most brilliantly trained people in our society. So are Renaissance tropes, practices of knowledge inherited from the Renaissance, still impeding us from being decent human beings? Or might they support efforts to the contrary? I'm of course very aware that your book is not about our current times, not directly at least, and so please feel free to ignore this comment in particular. But I do look forward to hearing more about your plans for future work and where they might take us all. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Zoltán. I'm going to pass over now to Andrew, who'll take us to a different place, I believe. Andrew, you need to unmute.
Yes, okay, sorry. Thank you very much to Zoltán, Katherine, and of course to Jennifer and to the Torch team. A very different place. I doubt Russia was some sort of Hyperborean dark space on the 17th century map, and certainly not within the compass, not on the compass of the voyagers Jennifer Oliver's book so brilliantly describes. So the challenge for me in as I was reading this learned and very well expressed book was finding points of intersection with the Russian world I study, because Russia's direful spectacles were many in the 17th century, but they're largely not nautical. So I thought I'd begin with a bit of prehistory and then take us to one case study in the 18th century in the world of the Enlightenment, where I think we see actually a convergence of the kind of vocabulary and social concerns, the vocabulary of compassion, spectatorship that Zoltán and Jennifer have already described. So in Russia of the early modern period, by which I mean the 17th century, nautical vocabulary is attested, but its use is largely restricted for Christian didactic writing, homiletics. Otherwise, the question of shipwrecks occurs largely in legal texts, which are treated as commercial catastrophes and at no greater with no greater sophistication than required. Russia had no navy until the 18th century, and its maritime commercial fleet came later. And science and geography reached Russia in the 18th century, and voyages of scientific discovery were normally overland. Cartography as well probably followed, really not before the 1770s. So as I said, there are very limited points of intersection. At least in the early period, shipwrecks are noted in pilgrimage texts, which give accounts of visits to the Holy Lands by Russian monks, or in narratives about transfers of relics. So salvation from a shipwreck is an important topos. The shipwreck is an event largely, and ships are not symbolic, and there's no question of moral anxiety attending the disaster, nor considerations on the folly of seafaring. So far, these are points of difference with the discourse of the shipwreck that is described in Jenny's book. The most prominent example of the nautical language in early Russian culture can be found in the Book of the Helmsman, Kormchaya Kniga, which is a vast compilation of texts on canon law that probably reached the Slavic lands in the 12th or 13th century through Bulgarian intermediary texts, and was then re-edited and eventually printed in the 17th century. The principal role of this navigator, the helmsman, is to lead the faithful to a safe spiritual harbor. In an important 17th century religious autobiography, so a different text, the image of the raft going down and being sundered clearly has a symbolic function. Those who are thrown off and survive have been rebaptized into the true Christian faith, whereas those who perish have not. By the 18th century, which sees the development of a secular literature in Russia, the Book of the Helmsman was no longer an important source. The image of the ship of state and the spiritual ruler's helmsman were established, partly by example of Peter the Great, who famously went to the Netherlands, in I think 1711, in disguise as a shipbuilder. A lovely legend that corroborated his commitment to modernizing the navy. So the image of the ship of state and the spiritual ruler were established, but only thinly, and attested mainly in neoclassical poetry and theatre as a metaphor for statecraft. The rise of the novel in the late 18th century does provide a new outlet for the shipwreck as a plot device. Most novels are of a kind Margaret Ann Doody would call romances. They are stylized in the manner of Greek novels, they have adventure plots. So the question whether the shipwreck in popular fiction reflects a particular mindset might be worth pursuing separately, but I've not had a chance to reread works like In Constant Fortune or The Adventures of Miramont or The Sad Love of the Marquis of Toledo. But I have a vivid memory, because I have read these books, which only exist in first editions and have not been reprinted. I have a vivid memory of the way accident in the form of the shipwreck pitted fate against individual determination in these tales. So there may be space for some sort of work inspired by Jenny's book. These novels are, interestingly, guided by a spirit of optimism that all will work out, whether because happy endings please the readership or because the author was guided by an optimism about the world and adopted something of a Panglossian view. So before I write myself out of the picture altogether as a respondent on this panel, as a bit of driftwood, I can happily save myself by referring to, well, at least one text. I've got a second text in a prominent example as a spare. But the most important example I want to talk about very briefly in the 2 remaining minutes is drawn from a book called Alexander Radish's Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, published in 1790, a radical book, a dangerous book. And as it happens, I've just published a translation of it with Columbia University Press. This travelogue contains a chapter, I think it's chapter 4, which is an extensive account of a shipwreck, one discourse among many different types of tales: sentimental tales, melodrama, documentary essays, dreams, allegory. Radishev, the author, had read Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and the narrator's journey from the first postal station to the end has some elements of a spiritual tale. We don't know whether he read Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, but merchant vessels were now part of Russian commerce, as were schooners and frigates, since the Russians had been very, very successful in combating the Ottomans in the late 1760s and opening a warm water port in Crimea and taking the battle all the way to the Bosphorus. Radzyszев was a customs inspector with oversight of the port of St. Petersburg. So while there's nothing to suggest that he was a connoisseur of wrecks, he would have heard tell of many, perhaps including the loss of the Vrov Maria, which sank in the Baltic on its way to St. Petersburg. I've got an image of that. Here we are. Share it with you. I hope it's appeared. So that was a catastrophe that became the subject of this large canvas by J.S. Cotman, called The Wreck of the Houghton Pictures, sold to the Empress Catherine of Russia, including the celebrated and gorgeous landscape of the Wagoner by Rubens. And the painting is now in the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge. In any case, the immediate source for Radzyszev's long chapter, all about a shipwreck, is a painting by Joseph Vernet, famously himself caught in a storm and shipwreck. And the chapter owes its drama to its ekphrastic relation to one of the pictures held in the art collection of the Hermitage. So here at least is an image equivalent to the Destruction of Lisbon, which was Voltaire's poem was translated into Russian a bit earlier, 1756, I think, and there were numerous Russian imitations in which a spectatorial space rehearsed the sublime horror of experiencing the greatest evils man can know. So I'm not going to give you a plot summary of the chapter, it's quite long, but the scene of rescue is a tribute to patience, it's a tribute to society, pitted against destiny. What makes it a fitting episode in Radzyszev's work, since his travelogue as a whole is concerned with social praxis and justice, in which models of altruistic behavior and corrupt egotism are considered, is that the language of the shipwreck in this chapter keys into concerns about the way individual behavior tests the bonds of community on board. The plot involves an abdication of responsibility by the skipper and a rescue that may result in a decision to deliver some at the expense of others. The attitude of those on board is of less concern than the attitude of the narrator who watches this disaster from the shore. The chapter is an exercise in both the necessity and limits of the sympathetic imagination, as Walter Jackson Bate famously called it. Radzyszev's view of both performed sympathy and detachment. His posture seems perfectly to incarnate the philosophy of the Lucretian spectator, whose regret for the disaster is counterbalanced by a position of tranquility and reflection.
Andrew, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute just to say we can't actually see your picture.
Oh,
could you try and share the screen again?
Yes. Sorry.
All right.
So it says, oh, okay. Right. Can you see the picture now?
No, I'm not sure why.
You are screen sharing.
Yep.
Sorry.
Okay.
Well, if you go to the Fitzwilliam, I've just got one more minute or less.
Yep,
but if you go to the Fitzwilliam website, you can find J.S. Cotman.
Okay, we'll try and put that in the chat. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
The sea monster coming from the depths. We should move on to conversation soon.
Can I just finish my point about Lucretius? I've got just a few sentences here. So we've got the spectator on the shoreline taking consolation from the fact that he's not on board. So while the experience of survival is transformative for those involved in the salvage operation, for the narrator, the spectacle is an occasion to consider ataraxia, the mastery of his own feelings. And this seems very much a response to De Rerum Natura and a consideration of how the mind offers a safe haven from nature's fury and affords a safe contemplation of danger. And the famous passage, the Locus Classicus in De Rerum Natura, I'll just read the 4 lines in a translation by Lucy Hutchinson. Pleasant it is when rough winds cease to form, on shore to see men labor in the storm. Not that our pleasure springs from their distress, but from the safety we ourselves possess. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have run over.
Thank you so much, both of you, and apologies for my sea monster interruption there. I just want to make sure that all our sailors get a chance to speak. I was really struck in the accounts there, the very different accounts, by the extent to which a shipwreck may or may not become an example, to use a Renaissance term. Andrew, you were saying that shipwreck is an event and the ship is not necessarily a symbol in the tradition that you study, whereas for us early moderns, it's knitted into that, to use Jenny's crafting metaphor, knitted into this question of exemplarity, and therefore we're coming up with a sort of set of counter examples. So Jenny, I'm going to ask you to respond to these readings, and then in a few minutes we'll open up for larger discussion.
Thank you, Katherine. Sorry, just a horrible moment where I couldn't unmute myself. And thank you both, Zoltán and Andrew, for your responses, which have given me much food for thought. I'll try and digest very quickly. But first, perhaps to respond to Zoltán's points, I think what you sketched really insightfully was kind of a trajectory of the evolution of the project, in a way, in that in early stages I was indeed focusing a lot on leadership. That I first came into the project through thinking about the figure of the author or the poet as the captain, and that's what sucked me into this whirlpool in the first place. And so in a way it was through focusing on the structure of the ship and my ever-growing obsession with materiality that I slightly moved away from leadership, but absolutely there's a whole other book in there about that. Similarly, as I continue sort of post-publication to think about this project, I see ever more clearly how the questions of coloniality that I start to touch on later in the book and in the conclusion in particular could have produced another book again, and perhaps should have produced a slightly different book, but I hope to continue to consider those questions. And on that sort of idea of the notion of the world as the backdrop, particularly for me, if I can just, you asked about where we go next. For me, that's also intersecting with questions of the blue humanities and the kind of eco-theoretical approaches that people are increasingly taking. So in between the thesis and the book came Steve Mentz's book, Shipwreck Modernity, and gave me much food for thought in itself. So that absolutely kind of helps to reframe. John O'Brien, who commented when he arrived to say hello, said he was looking forward to hearing what I thought about the book now that it was out, kind of thing. And yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to continue on those threads. Thank you to Andrew too, for sort of teasing out the continuity and change, as it were, sort of in time and also across different cultures and languages. Really interesting to hear that sort of shipwrecks feature so strongly in pilgrimage narrative in Russian as well, even later. And of course, to think about the Lucretian topos. So in a way, what I say in my introduction of the book is it's a kind of response to Hans Blumenberg's account of the history of the idea. He does talk about Montaigne for a few pages and a few very good pages, but obviously I'm expanding the view and zooming right in on the French 16th century, and sort of, in a way, the particular thing I'm expanding is that shift from the shoreline to the sort of plank or the raft that you describe as well in the Russian texts. So sort of part of the argument is here that at least one of the ways that happens is through this political crisis, and in parallel the kind of what have been called the hermeneutic crises of the Renaissance as well. So absolutely, and yeah, I need to go and look at all these terrific paintings and texts as well. So thank you both.
Thanks, Jenny. That was a terrific and very speedy response to these very large questions. I'm really struck thinking especially today about the ways in which early modern shipwreck may or may not be a moment of reading crises in our own time, right? And the extent to which we want the early modern to become an allegory for present events. On that note, I'm going to ask Wes to open up to the virtual floor. I'm already seeing some people I'd love to hear on this topic float around in the participant list, and Wes will know how to navigate us through those waters. Thanks very much, or I'm going to hope to intervene, if I may.
Okay, I think I'm back on screen, or will be in a second. So yeah, I think please do, people. We can see the list of people who are here, so please do send in some questions. Perhaps just to get something going, which is on the back of what Zoltán said and what that Jenny sort of responded to, but you know, she was pressed for time, and that's this whole question of leadership and the ship of state. Of course, Zoltán, in French writing of the time, the leader is not always male, and in fact, one of the things Jenny shows is that the Medici women, in particular, often become figured either as the terrific captains or the hopeless captains of the ship of state. And I know there's, again, a number of people here who've thought about that question. And I think, yeah, the ship of state is clearly still with us, not least in relation to, as you said, all the people trying to cross the channel in their various ships of many kinds. So I think there, again, in terms of the continuity and change, there's a long question both about the gender of the leader in relation to the ship. Ships in French can be masculine or feminine depending on how they're configured, but also the sort of the mode of transit from one place to another, the precarity of it, and so on. That's just to kind of get things going, really. I suppose the other thing that people might want to think about is what was central to Andrew's piece, which is about ekphrasis and the degree to which ekphrasis and the spectator figure, being the reader, of course, or the reimaginer, is also part of this whole tradition of writing. At the moment, unless I can't see things, none of you excellent attendees have sent me a question, but Catherine's got one.
No, I thought that the leadership point was in fact a question, and maybe Jenny would like to respond to it, but I know that other members of our panel would like to come in on that. Jenny, do you want to respond to this question of leadership?
Briefly, yes, and also to point out that it's a separate Q&A chat, and I can see that Andy.
Yeah, and I can see that now.
I haven't read it in detail, but I'm excited to.
I'll get to it.
But yeah, on the leadership question, thank you everyone for bringing us back to that. Because yeah, one of the threads in the book is, I suppose, tracing the ancient notion that there's a kind of essence which would make a woman a bad sailor, a bad captain in particular. So to think about kind of different forms of craft and statecraft, but also sailing craft as being, incompatible with femininity, and to think about the question of the fact, for example, in Ronsard's very praising depiction of Catherine de Medici as a helmswoman. To what extent does that make that not a real ship then? Is that a sort of a function of the fact that it's been evacuated of its real world context and connotations? So there's lots of things coming together there. And in Bruno, for example, it's always the captain's fault. In the collection of real accounts told to a landlubber and gathered together in a compendium of sorts, and a lot of the theological and political point there is that the larger group can't trust the up highs to act in their best interests and so on. So these questions are always being reformulated and tested, both in fictional and poetic shapings, and then in the real world accounts as well.
Thank you. We'll come back to kind of reshaping in a minute, and there are one or two questions coming through now. But Andrew, did you want to say something about the leadership and gender question too?
Well, I just wanted to, looking at it from, returning to the example I gave and thinking about another example, I just want to make two further points. The first is that this travelogue is really a radical critique and allegory. Almost every chapter can be read allegorically in relation to the reign of Catherine the Great. So the whole leadership question is built into almost every plot. But the second thing is that, in this shipwreck account based on, this painting, what's interesting, of course, is the abdication of the skipper. And that is clearly a metaphor for the absence of God. There's nothing providential. There's no invocation of a deity, no prayer, which is very surprising in the chapter. And this is an example of the Enlightenment traveler thrown back on philosophical responses to random accident, fortifying the self against a contingent universe. So it's a chapter which actually underscores the responsibility of the good citizen to save the other members of the cooperative and not depend on the leader. The good citizen's been spared from the shipwreck by doing no harm, keeping his critique of the world privately to himself, but doing everything he can to get everyone else off. I'll stop, but I just want to say there's another famous example, which is a really interesting contrast, which is a famous poem by Pushkin, written in 1824, called Arion, about the poet on the dolphin. which is all about the kind of egotistical sublime and the poet surviving a shipwreck and not caring at all, abdicating leadership totally, and saying the artist and the leader are totally incompatible, which is interesting because Romantic poets, including Pushkin, sometimes wear another hat and present themselves as prophets, as visionary, as alternative legislators of mankind. So this is a poem in which the poet says, no, I'd rather, I'm a survivor of that shipwreck, the political universe, and now I'm going to make my art private.
Thank you. Again, there's a whole series of metaphoricities in play. Before we come to, there's a whole bunch of interesting questions coming now. I'd like to just pick up on one which, in a sense, takes it back, reins back the metaphor for a minute, and that's Andy Fisher's question, where she says, picking up on Zoltán's observation about the location of shipwreck, could you talk a bit more about the difference between the Seine and the Mediterranean and the Atlantic? In other words, different kinds of water and the different questions of spectatorship there, Jenny. Because as Zoltán said, we have these narratives because people survive. Now, either people survive because they're on the boat or they're on the shore, and that tension between the two is going to be different in a river, on a sea, in an ocean. Katherine might also have things to say about this, I imagine. Katherine, do you want to start and give Jenny a break and give her a moment to think about stuff?
Sure. I want to start just by saying that something I was thinking about just this morning, Paul Lejeune's accounts of canoe shipwrecks on the St. Lawrence indicates to me, I think, that some river navigation by the 17th century, so this is a Jesuit account, is kind of fully Lucretian already, right? They've read the text so that when they're having the shipwrecks, the Jesuits are thinking Lucretianly. So there's a way in which different bodies of water might come to be reflections on earlier maritime experiences. There's a kind of intertextuality of the aquatic or something that we should talk about sometime.
We should, yes, thank you. And yeah, thank you, Andy. Absolutely, these different depths and salinities of water and the proximities they entail absolutely generate different sort of dynamics of cooperation, of compassion, of judgment, as Zoltán was talking about in his responses as well. One of the distinctions, sort of river to sea, that I immediately think of is not the Seine but the Rhône in Lyon, and the festivals and the kind of carnival-like stagings of shipwrecks of a kind that then differ again to the shoreline, but cultivated and choreographed, explosive and theatrical performances in La Rochelle, for example, and then again to go across the Atlantic to another kind of shoreline for Léry in Brazil. Yeah, a misreading precisely in a Lucretian mode of a canoe or a raft shipwreck of some sailing or fishing Brazilians who are very comfortable in the water, unlike the European travelers who've undertaken this voyage and are at much more risk than the Brazilians who are very comfortably, above, beyond, below the water's surface. So have a very different relation to the water and its kind of immediate culture. So the spectators do different things and readers do different things in those different settings. I need to think more about the Seine. I think it kind of links back as well to Zoltán's questions about what is the political unit almost that the ship might be. And Paris, of course, is one of those units that could be explored further.
Zoltán, we're riffing off your questions, but do come in and say more if you'd like to. Just before you do, perhaps I can pick up on Anne's question and extend the sort of the internationalization of this a bit further. Anne said she finds in her work on Dutch travel accounts that audiences get interested in disaster narrative rather than simply the travel account. Does this accord with your experience, Jenny? I think this is a kind of temporal question. Do things get more intensely disastrous later on? If so, why do you think this is? And I suppose we might also ask that question for Zoltán and the Portuguese narratives.
Not to pass the buck, but maybe I should just hand that to Zoltán. Yeah, absolutely.
I really don't want to say very much about it. Yes, I agree. I mean, there's in the Portuguese case, clearly there's a historical development that leads to an increased number of shipwrecks in the late 16th century. Technical, political, all sorts of other reasons that have been studied by hardcore historians. And that clearly feeds into a mood of a readership who wants to hear these stories. And yes, those stories are sometimes combinations of shipwreck accounts and more traditional land-based travel narratives, because, for example, as happened often in Southeastern Africa, you get shipwrecked, you get to the shore somehow, but then you still have to walk for about 500 miles or something until you get anywhere, really, which is absolutely horrendous. And so then come in all sorts of other land-bound stories, plus ethnographic and geographical descriptions. But I would definitely agree with Anne that there is probably a late 16th century, early 17th century increasing gusto for appetite for these dramatic. There's also a lot of chiaroscuro in these descriptions, especially of nighttime shipwrecks, ships going down, the screaming of the people, the howling of the wind, and all of that. So there clearly is a development, and I would agree, yes, there's a desire for these stories.
Thank you. As well as going forward, Susan Halstead has reminded us we can go backwards not only to Lucretius, but also to Horace and others, where the ship of state metaphor at least has a long, long history in relation to empire and in relation to imperial discourse. To change tack slightly, I think everybody else can see these questions as well. I'm not sure how this works, but turning to Neil and John's questions, which are both in some way about narrative and about imagining futures. In the case of Neil's question, it's a sort of, do the conjoined crises of this time, political crisis, hermeneutic crisis, produce a kind of narrative crisis whereby uncertainty about endings, about a kind of provisionality about how's this going to end emerges, and does that produce a new kind of suspense? Question number one. And allied to that, John's question about the sort of constructivist, a newly sort of, we can make things up, we can remake, we can rebuild. I'm putting them together because I think they're both questions actually about how you turn an event such as a shipwreck into a new kind of narrative about the future, or about how you might change the future. Again, Jenny, any thought? I know that you've written a bit in the book about suspense and about where it goes. Should we come back to you first and then see if anybody else wants to join in?
Thank you, yes, and continued thanks for all these great questions. Yes, I sketched out, and I knew it was too neat, but in my conclusion I sketched out kind of some of the big things I tried to say in the book, but one of the ways of messing that picture up again, and I think I always end up dealing with the messy and the blurry, is to remember, for example, the kind of cyclical suspense of one of the important precursors here, the Ethiopian story of Heliodorus, where we arrive after the shipwreck, but before we find out how the shipwreck happens. And so just a reminder that yeah, shipwreck doesn't always have to be linear, and certainly not linear in the way that I tell that kind of broad brush story about it in the conclusion. At the level of the chapters of the book, we find things moving very differently. But yeah, absolutely, I think to pick the example that comes to mind straight away, in Bruno, I maybe characterize it a bit over optimistically. Bruno does say we can always rebuild from shipwreck, but he also says, you know, in he's gathering these stories, what we rebuild can be very, very, very fragile, and it might get smashed, and then we have to rebuild it again. So there's a real kind of pragmatism there as well of, you know, you you do lose something in shipwreck that isn't always recuperable, but the things that emerge from it can be unexpected.
Catherine, you've got kind of things to say on this vein as well, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I was reading this book this spring when we were originally going to do this. I was reading it sort of alongside Margaret Cohen's book, The Novel and the Sea, which is mostly a reading of, you know, later European novels, 18th, 19th century, but begins with an account of Champlain's account of what makes un bon marinier, a good sailor. And so she talks about the kind of cunning that Champlain describes as being central to a certain figure of the novel, right? So her sea narrative allows for the emergence of the novel. And it seems to me that in contrast, your shipwrecks allow for the emergence of tragedy, or that there's a kind of theatricality rather than a rise of the novel that we see coming out of this wreck. And that's partly because of Les Portugais Infortunés and because of your reading of The Tempest. But does that seem right to you, that we're sort of, these are proto-dramas rather than proto-novels?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. And I think that's something that kind of pops up in the conclusion of the book. And it feels to me, as the author of the book, that it wasn't, oh look what has emerged, and it seems it's a play, and I wasn't expecting it to be a play. I thought it was sort of a book about narrative. So yeah, thank you.
I mean, it's also true that there are, you know, even Oxford World Classics collections of 16th and 17th century shipwreck plays. So The Tempest, you know, and Twelfth Night and all sorts of Shakespearean plays are part of a shipwreck play tradition, which again, Zoltán, comes from the Portuguese partly, but is clearly goes across Europe. I've no idea when the first Russian shipwreck play emerges, or whether it's yet to be written. But just as people are having to leave because we're nearly at 2 o'clock, I'd say we can carry it. We started late, and apologies for all the glitches at the beginning, but perhaps we'll carry on for another 5 minutes or so. Thanks to everyone who turned up and has to leave. And I think I've fielded all the actual sort of questions that people have asked so far. If you have any more, please do. We might go back to John's question. John O'Brien's question, which sort of put the suffering body alongside the ship of state as metaphors for the nation, just to think about bodies in these shipwrecks. Now, I have privileged information, and I know that there was going to be a different cover to this book that was a much more intensely embodied and powerfully, well, almost homoerotically kind of charged image. And there is a strong tradition in the writing and the imagery of the time of using the shipwreck as a way of thinking about bodies. Jenny, having set you up, do you want to say anything about that? But also on the back of John's notion that the sort of suffering body, it goes back to Katherine's thing about theatre as well, is also something that shipwrecks allow us to think about.
Yes, thank you very much. Just as, sorry, those of us in Oxford are perhaps looking slightly alarmed out of the window. It's got very tempestuous here.
It has.
Yes, and I'm very glad to come back to the body. That seems very fitting. And John's question absolutely points and reminds me of where I'm going now. And these questions of kind of suffering and feeling, I think, were quite latent in the book. And what I'm doing in my new work is to think about sort of analogies between bodies that are natural, animal, human, and mechanical constructed bodies, but also bodies like the body of the state, and what happens in the sort of the seams and the boundaries between those bodies, how they are policed or made more porous in the thinking and the writing in the period. John's question is about the compatibility of those images. And I think, as a question I think that he asked Katherine a while ago, is maybe one that will run and that I need to keep thinking about. I don't have an immediate answer to, but I sense that they're not entirely compatible, and that's a really helpful thing for me to keep chewing over. Thank you.
I think that's, sorry, I think that's right, because again, often in these kind of discussions, we like to put metaphors together and think they're all doing the same kind of work. But actually sort of separating out the charge of different metaphors and different metaphorical strands, you know, is enormously useful thinking to do as well. But sorry, I interrupted you there. You were going to say something else.
I was just going to say thank you for reminding me of that image that I didn't put on the cover of the book, which is a bit later. Yeah. And in fact, Andrew has asked me a question in the background as well about the images that do and do not feature in the book, perhaps. So one thing to think about is of the circulation of images. A question I get asked a lot is, you know, both in terms of, as it were, literary imagined images and the real woodcuts and engravings that are in the book. you know, to what extent is this just a recirculation of an existing image? And sometimes that is absolutely the case. So illustrations of Rabelais, for example, would be recycling some quite standard images. The images that accompanied the Ship of Fools texts were recycled in interesting ways, even within that miniature genre, and recontextualized as we go from La Nef des Fous to the Naufrage des Fous, where we end up with each page just mainly being the original image, or a copy, not quite so good, of the original image, with a few lines of text showing the potency of just the different figures, in fact the human figures mainly, but some of the ships are, yeah, sort of put a bit more center stage in the text there. And the same again in that one of the things the book is doing is thinking about commonplace. And if you take an image, be it a visual image or an evocation, a metaphor, and you put it in a new place and you turn it to a different angle, is it still the same image? And I hope that I say that, you know, in various ways through the book, in interesting ways, that it's not quite the same image, and that context is always evolving, and that in a way what's being moved is also bringing with it the new baggage that it acquires along the way.
Thank you. This is your last chance, panelists and others, to offer a final thought or two, if you would like to.
I'd just like to say I've long believed in Jenny's extraordinary powers, but that she can actually call up a storm as background to this discussion really takes it.
Yeah. Andrew has reminded us that Tom Stoppard's To the Other Shore trilogy is a contribution to, well, Russian shipwrecks, I guess so, but to the Russian shipwreck tradition. Clearly, theatre is a kind of strong strand through all of this, and the whole question of spectatorship. And to go back to the suspense question, one of the things obviously theatre is able to play with is whether what happens is kind of inevitable or there right from the beginning, and so on. I think we should probably wind up for now and go and confront the storm outside. But before we do, I'd like to thank everyone for turning up, and especially thank our panelists, Andrew, Katherine and Zoltán, and then of course most of all, especially thank Jenny for writing the book in the first place. Thanks all. Do come again to further discussions like this, and apologies once again for the glitches at the beginning, but we got there. If you haven't read the book yet, hopefully this has whetted your appetite to do so, and yeah, see you again soon. Bye. I think we